Hello and welcome back to the Ramsay Centre's Distinguished Lecture Series, and this is our first lecture for 2021. I'm Simon Haynes, and we're starting this year's programme with a real treat. Our chairman, the Honourable John Howard, is in conversation with the Right Honourable the Lord Moore of Etchingham, perhaps better known to you as Charles Moore, the eminent British journalist and biographer. He's been the editor at various epochs of the Sunday Telegraph, the Daily Telegraph, and the Spectator. He continues to be a prolific and highly influential columnist at both the Telegraph and the Spectator. And of course, he's the author of what will surely remain the definitive biography of Margaret Thatcher, a magisterial 3-volume work on a Prime Minister who herself defined the 1980s for Britain and in many ways for the wider world, not least through her friendship with and her influence on the then President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. And today's conversation is about that very biography and that remarkable era for the West. And in fact, as I think you'll see, the Iron Lady is effectively a third person in the room. It's quite a rare insight to hear Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister ever talking to the distinguished biographer of Britain's longest serving Prime Minister of the 20th century. So here are John Howard and Charles Moore in conversation about, or with, Margaret Thatcher.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a huge pleasure for me to tonight to be in conversation with Charles Moore, Lord Charles Moore of Eltringham, the authorised biographer of the great Margaret Thatcher. And I really welcome you, Charles, and I thank you very warmly for joining this conversation. There are a lot of subjects to cover. She was this wonderfully significant figure, and I'm so glad to have the privilege of talking to you. And can I start by asking you a basic question? How did you end up becoming her authorised biographer? And as a matter of interest, did she try and interfere in any way while you were writing the story of her life? She was not known as a person who sort of held back if she had a strong view about something. But please tell me how you ended up with this extraordinary honour of writing the authorised biography of the greatest British Prime Minister since Winston Churchill.
Well, thank you very much. And before I answer the question, the honour is all mine to be talking to you, particularly when we're celebrating the 25th anniversary of your first great victory, which probably had as much of an impact on Australia, but I would say a better one, than Tony Blair's great victory the following year in Britain. That's marvellous, and it's lovely to be talking to you. I feel out of respect for you, I should call you Mr. Howard, but we are quite old friends, and so if you don't mind, I will reciprocate your calling me Charles and call you John.
Please do.
But thank you for everything. Yes, I was asked by Lady Thatcher to write the book in 1997, and I think it happened then because she'd written her own memoirs and she had to dispose of the enormous number of papers, personal papers, which the Prime Minister leaves office with. And she decided to give them to Churchill College, Cambridge, a deliberate choice because her own university, Oxford, had snubbed her by not giving her an honorary degree. And when this happened, her advisors said, well, look, Lady Thatcher, somebody's going to write your biography. In fact, a lot of people are going to write your biography. So why don't you pick someone with whom you have a reasonable relationship and give that person access to the papers before they are released to the public under the 30-year rule restriction for government paper. And she very kindly picked me, and I don't know why precisely, but she did. And of course, I felt I must accept, though for logistical reasons, it was difficult for me to do. She said, you can have complete access to my papers and to me and to my family and to all the people who've been discouraged from speaking in the past, who I will now encourage to speak. And I will help you with all applications to world leaders and that sort of thing. And she also said she would give me interviews. But she made a condition, which were two conditions, which were that she should not be allowed to read the book, and it should not appear in her lifetime. And these were very, very important and sensible points, which I would have had to demand if she hadn't offered them, because otherwise people would think she's just going to control this book, and I'm just going to be the ventriloquist dummy, and its therefore its historical value would enormously diminish. So that was very good of her. But behind your question, I think, was the thought that, nevertheless, since she was, let's say, could be quite interfering, that she wouldn't.
Oh, no, don't ever accuse me of thinking that.
That she wouldn't leave me in peace, and that she would try to make me say things or prevent me saying things. But I was fascinated to discover this was absolutely not the case, and literally not once did it occur. And what fascinated me, and I came to realize, is that actually she wasn't very interested. She wanted me to do it. She was very nice. She was very cooperative, but she actually didn't really care very much. And I found that fascinating, because it seems to me that it showed that though she certainly had a great egotism, which great leaders do have, she didn't have that sort of funny male vanity where you always want to crawl over everything you've done in the past and show how brilliant you were. She was very much somebody focused on the next thing and on the relation between thought and action. And she didn't like looking back, which made her quite a difficult person to interview, actually. And so I really did have a free canvas. And the final thing I realized is that she didn't have the examined life. She was often very critical of herself because she was a perfectionist, but she wasn't always thinking about what sort of a person am I, how fulfilled am I. She didn't rake over the coals of her own past. And so I was almost working on a blank canvas, to mix the metaphor. I was thinking about things and investigating things that she hadn't thought about and hadn't investigated. And I found that very fascinating.
Well, Charles, thank you for that. Can I just make the comment that, for obvious reasons, Margaret Thatcher's life and experience and her time as Prime Minister were often linked with that of Ronald Reagan. The two of them clearly had a good relationship. They had a lot of common values and attitudes. But to what extent is it fair to say that Margaret Thatcher's lasting impact on British politics has probably been greater than Ronald Reagan's impact on American politics? Because I observed, of course, through working with Tony Blair. Tony Blair, of course, was Prime Minister of Great Britain for almost 11 years. And for the whole of that time, I was Prime Minister of Australia, and I worked very closely with him. And although we had differences, we got on very well. And I was conscious that the Thatcher legacy had affected him, not as much as it may have affected the Conservative Party. So to what extent is it fair to say that of all of the post-World War II British Prime Ministers, none has had a greater impact on the lasting character of British politics? And of course, in the case of Margaret Thatcher, compared with Reagan, an even greater impact than Reagan, great though he was, on American politics.
Well, that's very interesting. On the Reagan point, I wouldn't feel that I could really judge who had the greater effect on their countries, but it is true to say that Margaret Thatcher was already in office when Ronald Reagan became president, and she was still in office after he left. So he had no experience of another British leader, and she was the more dominant in terms of experience. And he had 8 years, but she had 11 and a half. And also because the executive power of the British Prime Minister, though obviously it's a much less important office than the American president, she did an absolutely fantastic amount. And in that sense, more than President Reagan. And also perhaps she had more of a doctrine, more of an ism, Thatcherism. I mean, there certainly is Reaganism, but I think it was a more sort of developed form of thought. you're absolutely right that it's had a lasting effect. She's had a lasting effect on British politics, and actually very notably on the Labour Party. One of the most interesting people I interviewed for the book was Mr. Blair, and he was very frank that he thought the Labour Party could only recover from its disasters in the 1980s if it fully recognised the success of Margaret Thatcher, and if it understood why she could achieve things that they had been unable to achieve, and how she'd managed to sort of put them in a corner in politics, and how she'd expanded conservatism. This was economic reform, it was trade union reform, and it was also her capacity to speak to a certain type of working class person, a more aspirational working class person, upper working class person, perhaps it could be said. Blair understood all of those things, and he said to me that he tested the new maturity of the Labour Party. The big test was, are they prepared to praise Mrs. Thatcher? And if they are, they really are making it. And sure enough, they won with an enormous majority in 1997. And at that period, you found more people at the top of the Labour Party who were praising Margaret Thatcher than you did at the top of the Conservative Party, which was in complete disarray. So I feel there's a sort of apostolic succession of success, if you like, not exactly of ideology, but of political success, which goes across the parties. And so from Thatcher, it didn't really pass to Major, it passed to Blair.
Well, I remember a statement of Tony Blair's that I often picked up and used in parliamentary debates in Australia when he said that fairness in the working place starts with the chance of a job.
Yes.
In other words, it was a statement of what the English would say, the bleeding obvious. And that's the sort of statement that Margaret Thatcher could have made. And it was one that stuck in my mind. And it spoke of an understanding, I suppose, of the impact of her and also the political reality, because as I understand it, she would not have won as heavily as she did on 3 occasions without getting large swathes of what you'd call working class voters, in the same way that Ronald Reagan got his Reagan Democrats. And if I may say so for the benefit of the Australians listening to this conversation, the Howard Battlers, or more recently Scott Morrison's Quiet Australians. They're descriptors of a group of people who's got a fundamentally common sense, patriotic attitude to the government of their country. And I'm interested in your view because it's struck me over the years of great similarities between our three societies, with all the differences. They are different, but there are also a lot of similarities.
I think this is absolutely right. And I think it exemplified in Mrs. Thatcher's rhetoric when she took on the trade unions. She was trying to side with frustrated members of the trade unions and attack the politicised leadership of the trade unions. She wasn't saying, trade unions have no role in our society. She wasn't saying, who cares about the workers? We only care about the bourgeoisie. She was saying, here is all this talent and opportunity which is locked up by bad and politicised trade union leadership, of which the most extreme was Arthur Scargill leading the miners' union. And I, Margaret Thatcher, are going to reform the laws so that the members of unions have more freedom and that they cannot be intimidated by flying pickets and that sort of thing. Also that the trade union leaderships become answerable in civil law for the damages they cause, so they can be fined. These were really, really important changes, and they were designed for the general good of the country, but also specifically to emancipate the more aspirational working class. And this they did. And people forget that in the miners' strike, one of the key things that delegitimized the strike was that Arthur Scargill refused to have a ballot of its members. And therefore, right through the strike, at least 20% and eventually 50% of the miners went on working. So they were sort of voting with their feet, the vote that Scargill had not allowed them to cast. And this gave Mrs. Thatcher enormous strength in this year, a battle that took nearly a year. It was a turning point. And it was very, very interesting that organised labour, which traditionally would always have been against the Conservatives, was not actually properly organised because it had lost so many of its members. And she spotted that and was able to win the support of such people.
On the miners' strike, one of the most vivid pieces I recall from your treatment of that in your biography was when Margaret Thatcher was presented with a series of replies to the wives or husbands of miners who'd broken the picket and had worked on. They were presented with envelopes attached to the letter with the Downing Street address. She said, take those envelopes away and give me plain envelopes, because what will happen is that these people will get persecuted when they know that they've been writing to the Prime Minister. I thought that was a wonderful illustration of her humanity, but also her incredibly meticulous attention to detail. Now, I mean, a lot of people, they just would have, a lot of Prime Ministers, a lot of ministers, they just would have signed it, and normally, the letters there and the envelopes attached, and I thought that was just a wonderful illustration of how consummate was her understanding of what life must have been like in some of those mining towns when you had a small section trying to do the right thing and every day worrying about persecution.
Yeah. I've very little to add to that. It's a very important summary that you make. I just add one thing, which is I think it was also to do with the fact that she was the first and only woman. So she had a great sympathy for miners' wives. Of course, all miners were male, literally 100%. So this is old-fashioned male labour. But she, and I think in a way that a male Prime Minister of the era would never have done, thought about what is this like for the families? What is it like for the wives? These working miners are being intimidated and threatened and their windows broken and so on. And Mrs. Thatcher sometimes accused of not feeling sympathy for people. It's true that she was very unsympathetic to some groups who she considered wrong, but she was highly sympathetic to groups that she considered right. And she also understood the impact of events on actual lives in actual families in a way that is a great quality of leadership, but is not actually that common.
Once again, on the miners' strike, is it fair to say that her taming of the power of the trade union movement, as exemplified by the miners' strike, was that her greatest achievement?
It was certainly very important. When she came into office in 1979, there were, I think, 29.2 million working days lost to strikes in that year. And when she left in 1990, there were fewer than 2 million working days lost to strikes. And we've never gone back. We've never gone above that figure since. And I think right now, well, of course, COVID is a special case, but I think nowadays, sort of 600,000 working days are lost to strikes every year. Complete transformation. And so when she was accused of bringing disharmony, which in some respects she did in some aspects of politics, she did not do so in the workplace, in the industrial sphere. She brought harmony, and that has persisted.
On the question of disharmony, Margaret Thatcher's critics claim that she divided British society, and her supporters argue that the nation was in such dire need of change and new heart and reform that the policies needed to deliver the improvements were inevitably going to produce a backlash. How do you weigh out the balance of those two propositions? Was she needlessly provocative, or was it unavoidable?
Well, I think you have to go back to why she was made leader. An grand old party like the Conservatives would never have made her leader in normal times. They would have made a conciliatory figure leader. But they knew there was a crisis, which was an economic crisis, an inflation crisis, a trade union crisis. a morale crisis, and actually to some extent a global crisis about the weakness of the West, and in the face of Soviet communism. And therefore they wanted someone who would, if you like, cause trouble, who would get up and do difficult and necessary things. That was the sort of job description, really, and she answered that job description. And that meant that there sort of had to be conflict, and you couldn't really get out of that, and you had to have a leader who was prepared to have that conflict. I think in the later stages, Mrs. Thatcher perhaps got slightly too addicted to assuming that she was right and that you had to have another battle. Late in the day, I can't remember the exact year, but let's say she left in 1990, let's say 1988, 89. She said something like, in an interview, she said something like, there are lots more dragons left to slay. And, people got a slight feeling, well, aren't there enough dead dragons lying around all over the battlefield? Wouldn't you like to ease off a bit? So, maybe that rhetoric was running out of its time, but it was necessary to achieve the things that were achieved.
Do you think she was headed for likely defeat in 1983, but it was only the advent of the Falklands War and the way she handled it and the response to it that saved her from a likely defeat?
Well, funny enough, I don't think that, because the Labour Party was led by Michael Foot, who was very left-wing and very ineffectual, and they were still on the floor. And also, the economic recovery which she sought had come very slowly, but it was just coming by 1982 when the Falklands War broke out. And she had 2 more years in which to call an election at that point. So I think things were actually beginning to look up for her already. But you're absolutely right to push the importance of the Falklands War, because that's what transformed the vision of her leadership. So until then, she was on probation, particularly with her own party. And lots of people at the top of her own party were intriguing to get rid of her. And they hoped, some of them, that she would fall because of the Falklands invasion by Argentina. And the fact that she won that victory absolutely comprehensively in a military and political sense, I mean, almost more comprehensively than it's possible to imagine, actually, it's so complete, made it impossible for her assailants with her own party to succeed, and elevated her global position so that she really did seem a most formidable leader, a woman leader winning a war, not really a known thing since Queen Elizabeth I, and really transformative, and evoked an enormous response in Britain. So, and she felt, I think, that she'd never lived more vividly and never cared about anything as much as she did about recovering the Falklands. Very, very important in her psychology and her self-confidence.
I think it's fair to say that her time in office was associated with quite a bit of deadly violence. There was the terrible murder of Erie Neve just before the 79 election. The murder of, it was Ian Gow, the parliamentary secretary, and the Brighton Hotel bombings at the time of the Conservative Party conference. Now, do you see these as entirely the product of the IRA's bombing campaign, or do you see them also in part the product of the division in British society at the time, partly, of course, conditioned by what she was doing to turn the country around?
I think they were really overwhelmingly to do with the Irish situation as seen by the IRA. And the IRA and the INLA, which was an offshoot, which is the ones that killed Erie Neve, saw her as the most formidable opponent they'd had in British politics, because she was determined to defeat them in a military sense. She was determined to identify them as terrorists, not legitimate politicians, and to defeat them on the ground. Hence her refusal to give political status to the hunger strikers, which meant that several of the hunger strikers died. So this, and her rhetoric was very strong. So this increased passions which were already running very high, and she went to #1 of the IRA's hit list. And despite the peace process, by the way, despite the Good Friday Agreement, she never went off that list in that position. So that until the day she died in 2013, she was the, as it were, price on her head was never rescinded. She was immensely conscious of the danger to herself and her family and her colleagues and great friends. When they killed Erin Eve and when they killed Ian Gow, they were killing two great friends of hers, very close associates, and that was deliberate. And those killings bookended her premiership. And of course, when they blew up the Grand Hotel in Brighton, they were trying to get the lot of them. They killed 5. One of her closest ministers, Norman Tebbit, his wife was paralysed from the neck down for the rest of her life, and she only died 3 months ago. And Tebbit, who is still alive, was very severely injured and is still in pain. She felt all this very strongly, and it sort of strengthened her resolve. I think there was perhaps some relationship to wider things going on in the United Kingdom, because the hard left, who she fought so vigorously, were very sympathetic to the IRA. Ken Livingstone, who later became Mayor of London, for example, and indeed Jeremy Corbyn, actually, who was a strong IRA supporter. So the passions rose within British politics as well as in the specifically Irish situation. But fundamentally, it was the IRA belief that she was a key figure that they had to destroy in their struggle.
Charles, moving away from a purely domestic scene, her close advisor, John O'Sullivan, who wrote a book called The Pope, the President and the Prime Minister, which of course was about Pope John Paul II, the first Polish-born Pope, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And it had the remarkable, I just recall the remarkable couple of sentences in it, said that at an earlier time, none of them had won a lot of support. The Pope, and I won't try and pronounce his Polish name or I'll get it wrong, we all know who we're talking about, was regarded as too Catholic. Margaret Thatcher was regarded as too conservative, and Ronald Reagan was regarded as too American to win acceptance. Now, when you think about it, that was a fairly remarkable retrospective put down, yet all of them in time assumed supreme roles, and together many people feel they did more than anything to bring down the Soviet Empire. What's your assessment of that?
I think it's definitely true, though I think John perhaps pushes slightly too hard the relationship between the Pope and Mrs. Thatcher. The relationship was a very good one, but there wasn't a great deal of it. When she was an old lady, I went with her to Rome, and I came with her to pray at the tomb of John Paul II. So this was something that she really cared about. But in terms of the sort of construction of the politics of ending the Cold War, I don't think the relationship was close, though certainly friendly. But of course, I think it was close between Reagan and the Pope, and above all, it was close between Reagan and Thatcher, very close. And to understand it, one has to recognize and remember that they were very against détente with the Soviet Union when they themselves were not in power in the 1970s. And they were very unfashionable in denouncing it. And partly their friendship was forged over that in the mid-70s. They said this is no good because the West is in a position of weakness. And then when they built up the strength in the early 80s through lots of things, including cruise and Pershing missiles in Western Europe, they then decided, actually led by Mrs. Thatcher, because she was the first to meet Gorbachev, that now was the time to change. We now could bargain from strength, and therefore we could be less cold and less fierce. And I think that was a very real thing. Reagan came around to it. Sometimes, actually, he terrified Thatcher because he and she disagreed about nuclear weapons. He really wanted to rid the planet of nuclear weapons. She thought the deterrent effect worked. And so there were real differences there. But essentially, the progress from strength to engagement succeeded. And the other key aspect of the engagement was that it wasn't just engagement with communist governments in the East. It was reaching out to the people of Eastern Europe and trying to emancipate them and concerned with their liberties. So that Mrs. Thatcher was, for example, fantastically popular in Poland, actually, particularly in Poland, where she did a very successful visit in 1988, because the feeling was she was speaking in a way that no British politician had done before since Churchill about their liberties and their opportunities and how they were curtailed by the Soviet Empire. And so it was a great big sort of moral and ideological crusade as well as a great power play. And fundamentally it worked. And that's why Soviet communism imploded, as well as its internal difficulties about economic policy. And it's why I think the Soviets didn't dare reimpose order by violence, because the sense had grown that their presence was completely illegitimate, and that the people of these countries, Germany, Poland, Hungary, and so on, had their rights, and these couldn't be trampled on, and that people shouldn't be shot. So I think it was a remarkable achievement by the people that John wrote about.
Just on the related issue, and that, of course, was the ultimate reunification of Germany after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Margaret Thatcher was almost alone in her opposition amongst European leaders to that, and it seemed, even to me from a distance, I wasn't in government then, I was languishing in fairly irrelevant opposition at the time, but I thought, gee, she's out of step with the tide of history on that. Why was she so adamant in opposing German reunification? Was it just a hangover from World War II, or was there something more to it?
I think you're right that she made a mistake here. I would say it was more of a mistake of a rhetorical stance than of reality. Basically, she was much too anti-German. She because of the war. She once, and it was sort of personal, she once took me aside at a party and into a corner so nobody could hear. And she said, you know what's the trouble with Chancellor Kohl? So I said, no, what is it? And she said, he's a German. which I knew already, actually. And
fairly obvious.
And she went on well with him at all. And this was very unfortunate in the whole way. It lost her friends in the whole situation. However, two important points to make. One is that Britain always rightly had a traditional fear of losing the balance of power in Europe, and that one power would be too great. And she had a legitimate fear about a reunited Germany, not, of course, about a sort of revanchist neo-Nazi Germany, which would have been ridiculous, but of too much German power. And this was associated, and here she was completely correct, with the growth of what was becoming the European Union. It was still called the European Community at that stage, but it was about to become called the European Union. And one of her passionate reasons for opposition to the single currency, which was a sort of trade-off for German reunification encouraged by the French, is that it would have the opposite effect of what the French intended. Rather than controlling German power by getting rid of the Deutschmark, it would increase German power, because it would mean that Germany had control over the entire money of Europe and therefore economic policy. And that the currency would be very favorable, give an artificially favorable exchange rate to Germany. All those things proved to be true. And her warnings were absolutely correct about that. And it was part of her growing anxiety about the increased centralization of EU power. So it fitted into all of that. And in that sense, I think she was prescient. And it's a great pity that she expressed all this in too hostile and argumentative and angry a way, because the fundamental point was right. And she was laying the ground actually for Brexit, and for identifying a deep, deep problem about the European single currency, which plagues Europe as we speak.
Do you think she was always at heart what we would now call a Brexiteer, or is it something she came to over time?
I think she came to it over time. She was always somewhat sceptical about the European community. She favoured entry, and she favoured voting to stay in the referendum of 1975 when she'd just become Tory leader. But she got increasingly fed up with it when she was Prime Minister, and she had tremendous rows with them about the money, for example. And in her famous Bruges speech, she was trying to appeal to the idea of a wider Europe. She said we should never forget that Budapest and Prague and Warsaw, which were then in the Soviet bloc, are great European cities. She was complaining about the little attitudes of the European community and trying to think of a wider, looser Europe. And once Jacques Delors, as president of the Commission, started to propose economic and monetary union, and with it, if he could possibly achieve it, political union, she was dead against it. And gradually her colleagues at the top of government and the European counterparts got together against her on all of this. And it was very much related to her fall. So just before she fell, she started to say, including actually in an interview with me for the Telegraph at the time, while she was campaigning in the leadership battle of November 1990, she went public with the idea that there should be a referendum on this in Britain. The form she wanted it was about whether we should be in the single currency or not, but essentially it was the underlying same issue as later became Brexit. This made her even more unpopular with senior colleagues because it wasn't government policy. She just invented it on the spot. But it was a forerunner. And once she left office, she became committed to the referendum, which eventually became the in-out referendum, and was very influential in that. And she also privately supported Brexit. She never came out publicly in favour because she was advised this would be too divisive, and she was getting old. But she did say again and again in private that she was in favour of it. The word Brexit was not one she knew because it wasn't used at that time, but that's what she thought. And she specifically and repeatedly told me and others that she wanted us to leave. So I think probably she was the mother of Brexit.
Mm. And another very contemporary issue, of course, is climate change. Now, I have to confess that I'm a bit of an agnostic myself on climate change, and it's an issue that I suppose the perception is that the governing coalition in Australia is more agnostic about it or more reserved about it than the current Conservative government in the United Kingdom. Margaret Thatcher is often quoted by the warmists, if I can collectively describe them as an icon of conservatism who recognised that the science was right and we had to do something about it, and that if she were alive and active in politics now, she would be campaigning for the Paris Agreement and everything else associated with the more alarmist point of view. What's your assessment of that, Charles? I think I'd be very interested to hear.
Well, thank you. It is an interesting thing. Like you, in personal terms, I'm on the agnostic side, but my studies showed to me fairly clearly that when she was Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, the warmist analysis is essentially correct, that she did believe, by the way, she was prouder of the fact that she was the first science degree Prime Minister than the first woman Prime Minister, or so she claimed. She certainly did have a science degree, and she was very, very interested in the science of global warming, and she believed it to be correct. And she made 3 very important major speeches about this from 1988 onwards while she was Prime Minister. I think she did believe that, and she wanted action. And it's also true to say that she wanted action through the United Nations. And the International Panel on Climate Change, which was then in its infancy, was much encouraged by her. Later, she somewhat revised her views, but I think that her real views, I think she was under some pressure then from skeptics. I think her real views were quite green. Where she did part company with green policies, of course, even when she was in office, where she was very, very concerned not to obstruct economic growth. So she was never in favour of, very high taxes on fossil fuels and that sort of thing. and she had a natural, if you like, Thatcherite prejudice against too much government control and direction. She greatly liberated the energy market and so on. So I don't see her as being a natural ally nowadays of the sort of net zero people, let alone of, I don't see her sort of sharing a platform with Greta Thunberg. But I think she was she did believe in the theory of climate change, and Thatcherites who don't like that really should, just as a matter of historical fact, admit it.
In all political parties, in all governments, human relations are fundamental to success or failure. And when you look at her career, she fell out with two really major figures in her party, and I think of, in the end, Geoffrey Howe and Nigel Lawson. And both of them were, interestingly enough, allies of hers on the fundamentals of economic policy. They were all monetarists. They believed in controlling government spending and believed in free markets. And she obviously fell out with Geoffrey Howe in the end over Europe, because that was the gist of his resignation speech to the House of Commons. But I find in what I've read that the falling out with Nigel Lawson was a little harder to understand, because although they had some differences about the poll tax, and I'll come to that in a moment, but I couldn't quite understand, apart from accepting it may have just been a collection of human relations factors, I couldn't quite understand what fundamental policy difference was with him, whereas I could understand it with Geoffrey Howe.
I think there was a fundamental policy difference which emerged with Nigel Lawson, and it was really about British membership of the exchange rate mechanism, which he favoured. He wasn't a fanatical European at all, Nigel Lawson, and in fact he became a Brexiteer, whereas Howe was a fanatical European. But Lawson wanted to what was called shadowing the Deutschmark, because we weren't allowed by Mrs. Thatcher to enter the exchange rate mechanism. And this was very damaging in Mrs. Thatcher's view for economic policy, because of the effect on the value of the pound. And she was also highly suspicious of the whole enterprise of the exchange rate mechanism, because it was a prelude to the single currency. So she thought that Lawson and Howe were conspiring against her, which actually they were. There was a famous so-called ambush about this, to get into the exchange rate mechanism. And she saw this as a threat to her power and authority, and also as leading to the European single currency. So there was a big European aspect to this. But of course, you're right that we're talking about human relations here as well. And she'd been in office by so long by then that it's only natural for colleagues to be sick of her and to hope that they get their day in the sun. She had always been rather rude to Geoffrey Howe, who she found rather sort of bumbling, and he wasn't her type of man as a male. She liked people who were more decisive, more sort of fine, upstanding people, and less waffly. She was pretty nasty to him. And eventually he turned. Nigel Lawson, she got on much better with on human terms, but again, there she thought that he was arrogating too much power to himself in the Treasury. He was too arrogant, and he was concealing things from her, in her view. I'm afraid a lot of this was to do with the passage of time, and she didn't get easier to work with as the years went on, and they got more fed up with her. And you will know, John, as a very successful politician, that the more you all hang around together, it doesn't necessarily make you greater friends. And I'm afraid that's what happened.
Really? Well, I can sort of on human relations. One of the most interesting things that John O'Sullivan said to me in a meeting we had some years ago, he was talking about Margaret Thatcher's relations with people with whom she worked, and he used the interesting expression of saying that she kissed down and kicked up. What he was implying with that was that anybody who worked for her, she treated with extraordinary courtesy. She was very polite and understanding of police and guards and the military and all that. But senior public servants and colleagues and probably a lot of people in the business community who regarded themselves as working with her, so to speak, she was more assertive, and it was sort of an inverse kind of attitude. Did you see any evidence that was a valid description of her attitude?
Yes, I think it's completely right. I think that as the one and only woman, she was very sensitive to being patronized by men at the top level, and hated it, of course. And she would say there's no second chance for a woman. So she understood that the club of men would do her in a way that they would not do another man in. So she had to be incredibly alert to risk. And she was therefore very jealous of her position, and very conscious that they might try to have her out at any time, which indeed they did try on about 3 or 4 occasions before they succeeded. So this made her very difficult with them. And she had no respecter of hierarchies. So she would enrage cabinet ministers, because if a young official said something which she thought was very good, she'd say, you're a marvelous young man. That's a brilliant point. Geoffrey, why don't you pay attention to what this young man's saying? Your department's useless, or something like that. And so she would be breaking all the sort of conventions of hierarchy, annoying them very much, of course, and actually embarrassing the young man too, because his career would be threatened by such basking in his ministerial.
He had to go back to the department, yeah.
Exactly. And whereas she treated Number 10, she really felt that she was at home in Number 10, and therefore she loved loyalty and people who were what she called staunch. And if they gave good service and good loyalty, she was fanatically devoted to them. So this would apply to policemen, as you mentioned, personal detectives, personal secretaries, private secretaries, diary secretaries, cooks, doormen, and all the rest of it. And again, the womanly thing came into it, because you may know that very little provision is made for the British Prime Minister about things like food. And so unless they're giving a formal banquet, they have to feed themselves and pay for it. Mrs. Thatcher, quite often late night, people writing speeches with her, she'd have them up to the flat and she'd cook them simple meals while they were helping her, that sort of thing, unconceivable for a man. And it was all very cozy and snug in that way. And she loved, for example, the girls who helped her decide what to wear. That was a great relaxation for her. And she had a great relationship with her hairdresser, who came in twice a week and did her, which was sort of half an hour of peace for her and relaxation. All those type of people, very considerate, very kind, always knew if their children were ill, very excited if they were getting married, all that sort of thing. It was very kindly and considerate atmosphere, and one of very close loyalty. And I think the rudeness to the top and the kindness to the bottom they were of a piece. They were sort of two sides of the same coin.
That's interesting character assessment. Do you think she gave John Major a rough time after he became Prime Minister by criticising him too much, or was she just exercising her right on issues she believed in?
Yes. No, I think she behaved badly towards him. I mean, and I say that as somebody who was very much in favour of, at the time, of her line on Europe, and I was against his. But I think that she did to him, without realising it, and perhaps without intending it, what Edward Heath had tried to do to her predecessor, which is sort of interfere with the light that should be shining on him. And she thought she was doing this because of the importance of the cause of Europe, and indeed she was very sincere about that. But I think she was not considerate to the needs of a new leader who has to try and hold his party together and deal with very difficult situations. And it kept bursting out. She couldn't control her outbursts. And one must remember that I think because she was thrown out not by the electorate but by her colleagues, she basically had a nervous breakdown. It was a tremendous shock, a tremendous feeling of betrayal. And she couldn't get right about that for a long, long time. I'll just illustrate that by an important point, I think, which is that Here's a good trick quiz question. Who got the most votes in the leadership election of November 1990? And the answer is Margaret Thatcher. Because in the first ballot, she got more than Heseltine, but not enough to prevent a second ballot. And in the second ballot, she wasn't standing, but Major, who won, got fewer votes than she had got in the first round. So when I met her and she was writing her memoirs after she left office, I said, "What are you going to call them?" And she said, "Undefeated." Because in her view, and which was factually, actually numerically correct, she had never been defeated. She won the leadership election in 75, the minor leadership election in 89, and all the 3 general elections, which she had contested as party leader. And she won the leadership election of November 1990, which she, quote, lost. So she felt, what have I done wrong? Why have you done this to me? I've done everything you asked me to do. And she found that very difficult to get over and very difficult to be generous to her successor because of that. And by the way, one additional point, which I establish in the book, is that John Major, though positioning himself as her heir in the second ballot, was secretly intriguing to make sure that she did not stand in the second ballot and was definitely actually against her.
Well, as somebody who's read every word of your 3 books on her, I remember reading that. It was interesting and so forth. I'll simply leave it at that. Why do you think in the end she lost the support of her colleagues, even though she was undefeated? I won't argue with that either, but in the end she reached the conclusion that she no longer had their support. Why? Was it the poll tax, or poll tax plus cumulative exhaustion with her leadership style, or something else?
It was both the poll tax and the cumulative exhaustion. And the poll tax was very important among backbenchers. But the reason at the top was more to do with Europe. And that's very important because it was the top, really, not the bottom, that got rid of her, because it was they that organised the series of meetings one by one when cabinet ministers came to see her to tell her in a roundabout way that she should go. This was organised at the top. The anxieties were to some extent in the wider electorate and in the backbenchers, but the actual, if you like, plot was at the top. So it was Europe, poll tax, and the passage of time, exhaustion, all that. And Europe was the one which motivated most the people with real power.
Do you think with the passage of time the regard for her has grown?
Well, there are a lot of people who are brought up to hate Margaret Thatcher, even though they don't remember her. You know, that there is obviously that strong, and it's very strong in the BBC, for example. And it continues, and there is always a great, and particularly in academia, it's very strong. So people tend to be taught that Margaret Thatcher was bad. However, whenever you put on a program about Margaret Thatcher and what she did, and you particularly recent one which ran a lot of documentary clips, people are extremely interested in it, and she's constantly dramatized, often unfavorably, but she's a great subject for drama and film. And I think there's another thing which has come into play very much in recent years when everything has been so difficult because of the crash of 2008-9, because of the rows over Brexit, because of COVID, all these things. There's a sense of leadership, whether you liked it or not, which was highly capable and which was capable of doing a great number of things, so that the capacity of the Thatcher government to deliver things that it wished to do, whether or not you support them, was unique. And this was very much driven by her. And so people are very interested in that. And I find even more abroad than in Britain, there's a sort of example of a type of leadership, and a type of woman leadership is of great interest to younger generations. I particularly find it in the Far East and in the United States and in Eastern Europe. and it's usually very favourable. It's much more controversial subject in Britain. It's less favourable in Western Europe, in the European Union. But broadly, internationally, globally, it's a very important example, and it sort of keeps renewing. And I believe because she's sort of mythological in a way, she's one of those figures that's not going to go away, like Napoleon or Wellington or Nelson, or this is one of Churchill, one of these, Queen Elizabeth I. It's a big story, and it's a very human one. And it's also, of course, in a way, in a loose way, a set of doctrines. So there is a thing called Thatcherism, very controversial but very important, and that's not going to go away either.
If I asked you to summarise her greatest domestic legacy, what would it be?
I'd say in absolutely specific terms, it would be trade union reform. But more generally, I would say it's a renewal of the belief that Britain can be a great change-bringing free society. And that it does that as a free and independent nation. So it's a recovery. It's a conservative act because it's a recovery of something that Britain had earlier achieved. But it's a modernizing act because it captures that past achievement and takes it into a new era and a new century.
That's a very good summary, if I can presume to say so, and as one of many of her admirers in Australia, and by the time I became Prime Minister of Australia, she was no longer Prime Minister of Great Britain, but I had the privilege of meeting her when I was opposition leader, and she was an inspiration on things like privatisation, which we from opposition in Australia in the 80s embraced as a policy. She was seen as a trailblazer and somebody who did have that lasting impact. Charles, you have been very generous with your time. I only wish that the restrictions on travel have meant that we have to do this remotely and can't do it in person. But, sometime, someday, all these restrictions will be lifted and we can travel again and we can renew the discussion in person. But thank you so much, and thank you very much for the elegant writing of 3 wonderful books. I've enjoyed reading them. I suppose ex-politicians read a lot of political biography, but these are in a class of their own, and the world should be very grateful to you for it, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for your two generous words, John.
I have no doubt you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. So let me add to our chairman's my own warm thanks to our distinguished guest, Lord Moore, for this fascinating revisiting of an era and a personality that are still very much with us and did so much to shape the contemporary world. Please do join us again soon. Until then, goodbye from me, Simon Haynes, at the Ramsay Centre.